Not on the committee. They'll address
We
it.
get started now. It's on my,
I may ask you a few questions.
my great pleasure to introduce Todd Jensen, a research assistant professor in the School of Social Work, the associate director for research in the Collaborative for Implementation Practice, and a family research and engagement specialist in the Jordan Institute for Families here at UNC. Todd is a family researcher focusing on family well-being in diverse contexts, support in family serving systems, and equity in family research practice and policy. As you can tell by his research area and the important roles that Todd plays in implementation, that he's one of the fortunate ones of us as researchers who gets to implement and observe the impact of his findings by applying them in real life settings to improve family well-being and promote equity in social work practice and policy. Along these lines, he is also a fellow of the Society for Social Work and Research and a co-founder and co-chair of the Diverse Family Structures Focus Group of the National Council on Family Relations. A few other notable characteristics I just want to mention about Todd. He's a sterling AdHealth user, has numerous research articles that he led, including several using the intergenerational data in AdHealth from the AdHealth parent study follow-up. And he's also a co-investigator on a $20 million grant that will be reviewed next month to collect some additional data on the parents. He's a strong quantitative methodologist. He teaches the fundamental methods courses in the PhD program in social work. And finally, he's a prolific researcher. As a 2017 PhD, he has 71 research articles, and that doesn't include chapters and things under review. Also numerous grants in basic implementation and policy research across multiple disciplinary journals. So with that, I am going to introduce Todd, and he's going to talk about building a productive future for family structure research. Well,
Thank you so much for the invitation to come and to talk. It's always a pleasure for me to be here with you all. Certainly want to build out some time for questions and discussion, probably at the end of my remarks. So if something strikes you, if you have a comment or a reaction or question, please hold on to that. I'd love to have that conversation. And so digging right in. So when thinking about a title for this talk, what verb should I use here? There's a lot of different verbs came to mind. Developing a productive future, articulating, pursuing, building felt right to me, because as we'll see, we can kind of track this larger area of research over several decades. And there have been beautiful articulations on how we might go about studying family structure as a developmental context in ways that are indeed productive and might allow us to avoid some common pitfalls we also see. So building feels right. I think we have a strong foundation to really build this type of work. And so I just want to do a little bit of stage setting, and I'm certain I'm preaching to the choir on a lot of what I'm about to say, but certainly in the United States and across the globe, a large number of demographic trends have really coalesced to highlight an incredibly rich landscape of family experiences, the sorts of social environments in which children are being raised and developing. There's a great amount of richness and diversity. And so when we think about the term family structure, definitely a focus of my talk today, we can conceptualize that in, I think, a lot of different ways. We can operationalize that in a lot of different ways, and often we're at the mercy of whatever data set we're using. But here, just as a kind of a friendly suggestion to conceptualize this particular term, we might frame family structure as any sort of general representation of a family system's relational composition, which could include the various dyadic components and relationship statuses, and these can transcend household membership. So kind of just keep that in front of us. And for any of you who may not see family structure as something of substantive interest to you, maybe we can just think about an empirical model that you've estimated. So some sort of statistical model, and maybe you've endeavored to control for some aspect of the family environment, perhaps some aspect of family structure. I raised that point just to highlight the fact that this is in all of our view, whether it's kind of in the periphery or at the center of what we're trying to study. So I think maybe there's something here we'll be talking about that will resonate with you regardless of your area of study, presuming you study human beings, because families are just such a proximal social environment for individual development. And so one question we're really looking at today is what approaches have been used to empirically explore the diverse family structures that we experience and that we observe in a variety of populations. And so that's kind of what we're going to try to do a little bit today, is really track this literature, think about what some promising next steps would be for building this area. So here I'm going to call our attention to an article published 33 years ago in the Journal of Marriage and Family, Marilyn Coleman and Larry Ganong of the University of Missouri, in their decade review article, focused on this literature attending to family structure and its association with other variables of interest. They made the following remarks. This literature is marked by two general paradigms. The most prevalent approach has been to view diverse family structures from a problem-oriented perspective, typically through use of a between-group analytic approach, which we'll dig into a bit today. Another approach attempts to describe and understand diverse family structures without a priori assumptions of negative outcomes. We often see this done through within-group analyses that incorporate what we could call a normative adaptive perspective. So we'll unpack that a little bit as well. So let's dig into each of those in turn. So between-group analytic approach typically emphasizes outcome differences among individuals who possess varying family structure experiences. And generally, in the pursuit of those analytic models, we have to select a reference group. So to which group will all other groups be compared? And often this does reflect that kind of problem-oriented perspective. We have to essentially select a winner to which all others will be compared. And so this can also be referred to as a deficit comparison perspective. That's been charted again for the last several decades. We've seen this approach active. Now, that isn't to say there isn't value in this approach. And so I don't want to suggest there isn't any value, but while these models can enable us to identify potential outcome inequities between different family structural experiences, over time it has been losing favor because it is limited in its practical utility in terms of policy implications and the development of interventions. We might observe mean differences across groups, but what does that mean for how to engage with families and meet them where they actually are in their lives? And so in contrast, the within-group approach accommodates the view that family structural transitions indeed might be normative and even adaptive, in this sense, the normative adaptive perspective. And so with this approach, we endeavor to zoom in on a particular family structure, understand the experiences of those who inhabit that social space, and perhaps even identify factors that are promotive of well-being. So what moves folks within a particular family structure to those higher ends of an outcome distribution? Because if we can identify those factors, those have huge and promising implications for policy and for practice, because we might identify key levers that we might pull through different intervention approaches. So I want to dig into each of these general approaches to family structure research, starting with the within group analysis approach. And so here I just want to feature some of the work I've done, which I've intentionally tried to tether to this approach, this kind of normative adaptive within group analysis approach. So again, just by way of illustration. So here in my work, I've spent time really zooming in on step families specifically, but I should note that also is not a monolithic family structure experiences. There's a great amount of diversity and heterogeneity in terms of what step families are experiencing, but still zooming in on step families. This is a common transition for many families in the United States and across the globe. And by way of definition, we can conceptualize step families as being formed when one or both adults in a new committed couple relationship brings a child or children from a previous relationship. And that couple relationship can be formed through cohabitation, through marriage, through even processes of living apart together. There's a host of ways we can inclusively view step families. Now, when step families form, these new relationships can be marked by a notable amount of ambiguity, right? If we were to take a quick survey of folks in the room and say, what does a parent do? We could probably get answers quite quickly, and there would probably be not a wide variability in what responses came in. If I were then to ask, what does a step parent do? That might feel harder to answer and might yield a much wider range of responses, and rightfully so, as we'll see. So because of the ambiguous nature of these relationships, right, the unclarity of the facts of what these relationships are or could be or should be, a variety of demands can emerge in these moments. And so Patricia Papernow has written extensively kind of on the clinical side of all this and through decades of practice experience working with step families. And Dr. Papernow notes the following 5 common demands that can be experienced. So one is individuals can experience persistent and pronounced insider and outsider positions that can be quite stubborn and stuck. Think of a new step parent coming into an existing family system, feeling like an outsider to the norms and culture of that system. And then the parent who's already connected to those children is left with this insider role where they're still connected to those pre-existing norms and culture elements. Children can experience losses, change, and loyalty binds. If I strive to increase the quality of my relationship with a new step parent, am I somehow being disloyal to a non-resident parent? And those tensions are things that some children do experience during these transitions. Parents and step parents can have diverging views on how parenting should be conducted, which can yield conflict. There can be this effort to manage existing family cultures while also trying to cultivate a new family culture that brings everyone together. And then certainly step families can have a relatively wide range of co-parental figures that transcend a single household. So their larger potential network of caregiving individuals and how to navigate those roles tactfully can be demanding. Now, with all the demands noted, it's one thing that fascinates me about step families is these moments where these new relationships form also represent incredible opportunities for new and unique types of relationships to emerge. And so I think a theme that we'll see here is that perhaps step families ought to be fully empowered to develop those relationships in ways that are optimal for them. And there's not a one-size-fits-all approach here. And so just kind of mapping this within group analytic research agenda, I'm just kind of visualizing some of the work I've been trying to do, and I'll walk through each of these pieces step by step. So first, looking at the right side of the figure, I really highlight child well-being. It's something that's really, I think, at the heart of everything I try to do as a professional. Having every single child be happy and healthy and thriving would be a world maybe we could all be excited about. And so we can think about child well-being as a multidimensional construct. And so in some of my work, I've tried to chart what do we know about the relationship between these different elements of child well-being and step-parent-child relationship quality. In other words, to what extent is step-parent-child relationship quality a driver, potentially a unique driver of child well-being? And so in a recent systematic review and meta-analysis, I identified 56 empirical articles that focused on this connection. Step-parent-child relationship quality is a predictor or correlate of some aspect of child well-being, and found across those studies there were meaningful connections between step-parent-child relationship quality and all of these well-being domains. And then taking that one step further, looking at all those studies that had sufficient statistical information to actually conduct a formal meta-analysis, I found that across 68 available effect sizes, the associations between step-parent-child relationship quality and psychological well-being, behavioral well-being, and academic well-being were especially pronounced and robust. And Some of these studies were indeed cross-sectional, so we can't really establish temporal precedents. There's likely some bidirectional and transactional links between these two general constructs. But some of these studies were longitudinal in design and essentially looked at residual models. They looked at what's the change in well-being over time that we see in the presence of a high quality step-parent-child relationship while controlling for baseline levels of child well-being. So we do have some longitudinal models. And some of these models controlled for other types of relationships. And so there seems to be a case to be made that step-parent-child relationship quality might exert positive influence on child well-being above and beyond other relationships that a child has in their life. So that link feels, I think, strong. So now the question is, well, how do we increase that relationship, the quality of that relationship, the step-parent-child connection? What are the predictors and correlates of that? What are those kind of malleable factors that we might target in some sort of intervention or policy effort that could help move the needle on step-parent-child relationship quality and thus move the needle on child well-being? And so in another systematic review of 23 studies, probably due for an update soon, actually, so that one was published in 2015. The various predictors and correlates of step-parent-child relationship quality could really kind of cluster within one of four main categories laid out here. So some factors included individual characteristics, features of the child, the step-parent, family characteristics, features of the larger family as a social system and social environment. Other predictors and correlates fell under what I've labeled step-parent-child interaction, putting the parentheses there because this could include parent-child interactions and step-parent-child interactions. And then features of step-couple dynamics. And so looking at some of these and noting which of these characteristics felt maybe particularly malleable or movable or adjustable, I, in some of my work, have zoomed in on this piece, the step-parent-child interaction piece, wanting to unpack that a bit more. What types of interactional patterns might exist and how are those associated with step-parent-child relationship quality? And so here we bring in AdHealth, the AdHealth data, and looking at wave one, here I zoom in on those youth at wave one who reported residing with a mother and a stepfather who also had living non-resident fathers. And so the analytic sample here was 1,183 youth. Is there a question here?
Yeah, just clarification. When thinking about step parents, does it presume marriage, like a legal step parent, or when does a relationship become a step parent figure? I guess
it depends on who you ask. I love the question, and when you ask. If you go back 20 years, people probably say, yeah, when folks remarry, that's a step family. But the definitions have become far more inclusive to account for different types of relationship statuses. Could be married, could be not, could be living together, could be not. And so it's more fluid now, I would say. But in this case, not all of these step families were, the couples weren't necessarily bonded by marriage. Many were, but not all.
but they were
They
co-residing.
were co-residing or married, that's right.
Okay. Yeah.
And apologies if your question was intended for this specific analysis and not this larger.
No,
area.
larger area.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
No problem. So this analytic sample of 1,183, just some sociodemographic features here. Now, in the wave one in-home survey, youth were asked whether they had engaged with their stepfathers in any of these following activities during the past 4 weeks. And they could indicate, yes, I did engage in that behavior, or 0, no, go to 0, I did not. And then also kind of a catch-all here for none. And you could essentially confirm that they, folks who selected no on all of these would have selected yes for none. So that was pretty consistent. But here we can just look at the general proportions of yes responses, see what types of interaction patterns are notable. So there's a percentage of youth who are engaging in these activities. And so one question I had, well, what precise patterns across these different types of interactions exist in the sample? Are there unique sub types of interaction patterns? We have 2 questions.
Yeah, I was wondering, are these separate from conversations with the mother, or could this be sort of at dinner or as a group thing? or do you know?
Oh, I don't know that that's piece is specified. I know they are asked these same questions of the other parental
Oh, okay, so
figure.
you can at least contrast.
So you can
whether
at
the-
least, yeah, parse that out, at least to that extent.
Got it.
There's a question here.
Kind of related, just a clarification, is this reported from by the step parent or?
Great question. This is youth's perspective.
Okay,
So this is youth saying, yes, I did engage in that behavior with my stepfather in the last 4 weeks.
Last 4 weeks, yeah.
Yeah. And so one thing I wanted to do was look at all of these indicators of interaction and see what patterns might emerge. And so I came to these variables and implemented a latent class analysis approach. And, relying on a number of statistical and substantive criteria, you can really endeavor to extract an optimal number of classes or unique patterns across item responses. And then once finding an optimal solution, an optimal number of latent classes marked by their own pattern of interactions, look at potential differences between those latent classes across a number of covariates, including step-parent-child relationship quality, which is kind of my focus here. And so here is a 4-class solution. So the class enumeration process yielded a 4-class solution as being arguably optimal. And so I'll just walk through each of these patterns in turn. This is just a visualization of the solution. So along the x-axis, I have all of those items that youth were asked to respond to in terms of whether they did that thing in the last 4 weeks with their stepfather. And you'll see none at the end if that was indeed the case for them. And then the y-axis represents a conditional probability. So if I'm in a particular latent class, what's the probability I said yes to one of these items? And so that's what we're mapping out visually here. So starting with what I've called the inactive pattern, the blue line, 19% of youth clustered into that pattern, and you'll see they had a 0 probability of endorsing any of those interaction items and a 100% probability of endorsing the none. Fair enough. So about 1/5 of youth met that, or was clustered into that pattern. So then moving to the red line, 38%, the largest pattern, 38% of youth clustered into what I've called the academically oriented pattern. And you can see there's some non-zero probabilities of endorsing all of these items except for the none, but especially high probabilities for endorsing a couple of these items related to school. Talked about your schoolwork or grades, talked about other things you're doing in school. So I labeled that academically oriented with a sprinkling of other things that aren't necessarily improbable, but not as probable. And then moving to the green line, 31% of youth clustered into this pattern I've labeled casually connected. And you can see the probability of endorsing some of those academic items is actually near 0, but there's these notable non-zero probabilities of endorsing some of the others. And so casually connected. So things like played a sport, gone shopping, attended a religious service together, talked about things going on in my social life, things of that sort. And then the last pattern, the remaining 12% of youth, that purple line, you'll see these notably moderate to high probabilities of endorsing all of the items, again, except for the none. And so these, this particular pattern was marked by a reasonably high probability of engaging in all these various facets of family life over the last 4 weeks at least. And so then the question for me, do these patterns matter for other variables I might be interested in? And rather than unpacking all the variables I looked at, I want to focus on one in particular that's most relevant in this context. Step-parent-child relationship quality. Do we see varying levels of step-parent-child relationship quality as we look across these patterns? And so I took a 5-item scale measuring the quality of the step-parent-child relationship, standardized it. And so these are z-scores. So a value of 0 for any class would mean sample average level. They're right on average for the sample. Values above 0 indicate a positive deviation from sample mean levels or above average. Negative values represent negative deviations from the sample mean. And so we can look across these 4 patterns, some general expected levels of step-parent-child relationship quality, notably high levels in the versatile and involved pattern, above average levels in the academically oriented pattern, slightly below average levels, but near average levels in the casually connected pattern, and notably below average levels in the inactive pattern, perhaps unsurprisingly. And again, I'm very cognizant of the likely transactional bidirectional link here. The types of interactional patterns we observe and the quality of the relationship undoubtedly have a bidirectional transactional link. As the relationship gets better, I might interact more and in more ways. And as I interact in more ways and more frequently, the relationship might improve. So I'd want to just flag that. So just a take home here for me is reasonably high or close to average relationship quality levels for the step-parent-child relationship appear in multiple patterns. There's not necessarily one that, and only one that will yield near average or above average step-parent-child relationship quality. So again, here just illustrating the potential practical utility of a within group analytic research agenda, zooming in on step families, getting a sense of how child well-being is tethered to something like step-parent-child relationship quality, seeing how that is predicted by these other correlates and predictors, zooming in on a subset of those, and trying to get additional storytelling in terms of what psychoeducation programs might we develop or other intervention programs that could share some of these insights with families and maybe empower them to find out for themselves what type of interactional pattern makes sense for them. They don't have to be versatile and involved necessarily. That might not be optimal for their family context. Maybe one of these other patterns would be. So that's, again, just by way of illustration there. And so here, shifting back to this kind of other direction we might go if we're at this fork in the road, between group analyses. So what have these analyses looked like in the last couple of decades? And so recall that these types of analyses emphasize outcome differences among individuals who possess various family structures. And given the persistence of research of this sort, there are valuable opportunities to compile and synthesize studies on this front and really get a sense of how this research is being done. And that could generate some maybe useful insights in where research on this front could go next. And so a colleague of mine and good friend, Dr. Caroline Stanner at Virginia Tech, her and I came together to conduct this scoping review of 283 studies published that use this between group analytic approach, looking at relationships between family structure and well-being. And we wanted to track a few components of that literature, including how family structure was being measured. Also, what approaches were being used to analyze associations between family structure and well-being. To what extent are specific theories being applied and for what purposes? And how is well-being being conceptualized? So these are just a few things we tried to unpack. And just looking at these 283 studies and where this work has been conducted, clearly, a lot of this literature is North American, with some European studies, but the vast majority of studies taking place in North America, largely the United States. We do have some studies taking place in Asia, Africa, Australia, a few cross-continental studies as well, a couple from South America. And I should clarify here, these are all self-described family structure studies. So easily could have missed some studies that didn't use those terms to kind of shape the boundary of what they're trying to accomplish. And these are all studies published from 2000 onward. And so looking at how family structure was measured, we saw a wide range of approaches on this front. And so one approach incorporated what we call the transition binary approach. So this would reflect some sort of variable I would insert into my model that indicated whether any family transitions had occurred in that person's family experience or not. Yes, no. Any amount versus none. Other studies looked at the actual number of family transitions, so treating that more as a continuous variable and maybe getting a sense of dosage. Is there a dosage here that seems to matter for outcomes? How many transitions you experience or not? Other studies used this, what we call the static approach. So I'm going to zoom in on a particular point in time and just see what family structure are you in, what family structure are you in, create these family structure groupings that I can then compare. So probably a very common approach. Piecewise approach, rather than trying to nest cases into a kind of a more global family structure type, this approach included a set of variables that essentially served as on-off switches with respect to a specific structural component, maybe relationship status, maybe the presence of a certain number of children or not, or the presence of children or not, having ever experienced divorce or not, things of that sort. So this kind of piecewise approach to kind of patch together different potential characteristics that might have been experienced. And some models in this literature use both. They brought both of those things together, the static approach and the piecewise approach. So accounting for both of those types of variables. So call this maybe a hybrid static piecewise approach. This approach really interesting. So other studies used, in some cases, rich longitudinal data, at the least retrospective data, but many longitudinal, and estimated the proportion of time, for example, between birth and age 18, that a child spent living in a particular family structural environment. And then was able to track the proportions of time spent in any number of relevant family structures evident in that sample to then see if that had associations with child well-being or other outcomes. Dynamic approaches, these are more longitudinal in nature. So maybe at least I have 2 time points spaced out with a reasonable amount of time lapse. I look at where folks are in terms of their family structure at the first time point. I revisit them at the next time point and see if they're still in that structure or if they have transitioned to a different one. And then try to create variables that accommodate every potential type of transition, whether they stayed in the same, what one they were in, did they stay in the same one or did they move? And so you could actually get a pretty complex network of variables through that approach, but you get maybe a little additional nuance there. And then in very few studies, I want to say even just maybe one, a latent class approach. They just took all of these different family structure variables, threw it at these kind of finite mixture modeling approaches to see if there were these distinct patterns of family structure characteristics that emerged that were made up of a very complex set of characteristics. So that was not quite as common. Notably, less than 3% of studies accounted for sibling complexities, such as the presence of half siblings or step siblings. And we might frame this as a notable omission because sibling ties have important implications for child outcomes. And an increasing number of studies are showing that. So now, how are folks trying to connect family structure and well-being in this literature, at least from 2000 onward? 87% of studies reviewed, of those 283, incorporated this approach, a direct association between family structure and well-being. 23% expanded their view a bit by looking at indirect associations between family structure and well-being through some theoretically plausible mediating mechanism, trying to identify some causal pathway. 30% of studies looked at some other variable of interest as a moderator of the link between family structure and well-being. So in other words, what are the conditions under which family structure and well-being are connected? I have this other variable I think can influence that, the magnitude and direction of that link. And then just kind of an expansion from there. So 1% of studies incorporated these more intricate moderated mediation models where we have some mediational pathway from family structure to well-being via some mediator or mediators of interest, and looking at whether some other variable I care about moderates those indirect links, moderates that mediation pathway. In other cases, about 12% of studies actually moved the location of family structure in their analytic space and looked at family structure itself as a moderator of links between some other variable of interest and well-being. And then from there, another form of moderated mediation, looking at family structure as a moderator of these indirect links between some other variables I care about and well-being through some mediational pathway. Less than 1% of studies incorporated that approach. And I think lastly, less than 1% of studies incorporated this approach, taking some family structure characteristic I care about, and whether that moderates the influence of some other family structure characteristic I care about in terms of its impact on well-being. So we did see that pop up in some studies as well. So again, just charting how this work has been done roughly since the turn of the century. In terms of application of theory, we coded a study as atheoretical if the authors did not explicitly identify a theory or perspective that framed their research question or hypotheses. 63% of studies in this literature were atheoretical. These atheoretical studies were definitely diverse in terms of what they were trying to accomplish, but there was also a notable amount of consistency across disciplines. Many of these studies were positioning these first-time biologically connected nuclear families as being able to yield higher levels of outcomes of interest relative to their counterparts in other family structures. And an incredibly common design and approach to the analysis, with or without theory. But in this case, many atheoretical studies did that. And in these cases, often in the kind of build up to the analytic approach, the introduction section in literature review, when theory wasn't presented, oftentimes past studies trying to accomplish similar things were presented and summarized. So essentially, these other studies found this to be the case. This particular family structure seems to perform better than its counterparts. Therefore, we're going to test the same question here. So that was a common situation. In terms of just the prominence of this approach, we could call this the deficit comparison approach, specifically using that stable biological two-parent family as the reference group in the analysis. Looking at these 5-year time segments since 2000, this is the proportion of studies that do exactly that. So the vast majority of them across these time segments. When theory was used, it was often used as a basis for explaining why the two-parent nuclear family would be optimal for individual well-being. And some of those theories are outlined here, things like resource and investment theories, stress and instability theories, social learning theories, intergenerational transmission theories. There are other broad theoretical applications as well. We saw life course theory, ecological theories, structural functionalist perspectives explicitly applied. And we should note that in many cases, when an analysis is set up to pit particular family structures against each other with respect to well-being, many of those analyses, whether intended or not, are actually invoking a structural functionalist perspective. So I just want to kind of flag that piece here too. So overall, in summary, many investigations presumed with or without theory that two biological parent families would exceed other family forms in terms of their ability to yield positive outcomes. Yeah.
Were you looking at studies only in the US?
No, so this was an international pool of studies, largely from the US and North America, but some that came from other places as well. In terms of conceptualizations of well-being, here is a list of the different types of outcomes that studies attended to. Outcomes across academic, physical, mental, behavioral, socioeconomic, and relational constructs. And the overwhelming focus in these studies was on problems in pathology, with only 5 studies explicitly measuring some positive aspect of well-being, 2 of which explored prosocial behavior, and the remaining 3 studies looked at some aspect of positive development, things like youth flourishing and prosocial maturity, among others. So, I know I picked up the pace there for those slides, but just to conclude, and returning to this topic, building a productive future for family structure research, indeed, I think that's the right verb. Looking generally at these 2 potential directions to go, and standing maybe at this fork in the road in some cases, ultimately, I think we can be quite intentional at that fork. Which way am I going, between group or within group, and why? And if I choose one of those routes, how do I optimize the work I'm doing there? And for what purpose am I doing it? Some types of analyses are easy to do and they can be quite fruitful. You can get good papers from them. But what do I want to accomplish with those findings? Who are these findings in service to? And so I think those are important questions. And in terms of overarching perspectives, I think we can bring to our thinking about building a productive future in family structure research. One is, how can we course correct what's being done and has been done? Family structure research has been around a long time. It's been informing policy. A lot of it's between group analytic. It incorporates between group analyses. That is a large ship that has left the harbor. How do we correct the direction that ship's going? How do we clearly articulate where that ship ought to go and why? So course correcting, I think, is a broad perspective that can be helpful in framing what we might want to accomplish. Another is course creating. What if we just completely dismantled how this research is done and we're to just build it up anew? Given what we know now, given what we want to accomplish, what could that work look like if we had a fresh start? I think there's room for both of those perspectives, course correction and course creating. And so here I'll conclude with just some friendly ideas, a very non-exhaustive list of ideas that might be worth considering. And so one is, especially if we go the between group analytic approach, there seems to be so much value in acknowledging and exploring the potential overlap in outcome distributions across family structures. I'm not the first one to say this. We can go back several decades and see scholars talking about this. To what extent do members of different family structures have overlap in the distribution of an outcome I care about? It turns out probably a lot of overlap. They might have statistically significant mean differences, but the distribution might be notably overlapped. Noting in the scoping review of the 283 studies reviewed, 269 had a continuous outcome variable. So outcome distributions could be mapped. 20% reported any amount of information about the distribution of the outcome, often just by reporting a standard deviation. What if instead we incorporate more data visualization tools? What if we actually look, as my colleagues here did, Luke Russell, Jonathan Beckmeyer, Larry Guénon did this piece, rather than supposing that the whatever family we want to pitch as being optimal, maybe the nuclear family, seeing their outcome distribution here, we're looking at child flourishing, rather than assuming that one particular family structure has this distribution that centers toward that high end, and maybe all other family structures are much more toward the lower end of that distribution, potential values. If we actually map those distributions across a number of different family structures, there's a tremendous amount of overlap in this construct, as an example, child flourishing. So that's interesting and I think worth acknowledging. There's a number of tools we can use, increasingly sophisticated data visualization tools. Other fascinating metrics. One here I found, the distribution-free overlapping index. It's actually a way to quantify the extent to which outcome distributions overlap, ranging from values from 0 to 1, where 1 would indicate perfect overlap and 0 would indicate perfect non-overlap. So we can quantify that. So if we want to look at mean differences, why don't we also quantify distributional overlap? Because that can tell a fascinating story as well. My non-exhaustive list of ideas, idea number 2, perhaps we can move beyond positioning first-time biological two-parent families as the gold standard comparison or reference point. There might be a lot of reasons we could consider this. Perhaps one important reason being many of us do not currently experience a family of this type in the United States and elsewhere. For a variety of different reasons, we can find ourselves in a dramatically different family arrangement that works beautifully for us. So maybe we can just continue thinking critically about what's our reference group and why. Again, what am I trying to accomplish with my research? Another idea might be to try to overcome stagnant theorizing, to incorporate theories that can really enrich and expand our thinking about what questions we should ask and how best to answer them. That could be a whole hour-long conversation in and of itself, but just enriching our theorizing. Some of my colleagues, Dedrick Williams, Caroline Sanner here again, we've been doing a little bit of writing in this area, and Dedrick Williams really calling attention to the potential value of critical perspectives on this front. could be a useful direction to follow, perhaps. Idea number 4, and I'm getting close to the end. Investigating the specific conditions under which family structure actually exerts influence on well-being, with particular attention to experiences across racialized groups. So here I would really highlight the work of Regina Baker, Dedrick Williams, Christina Cross. They're doing beautiful work in this area, looking at family structure as a correlate of well-being, but for whom? And if you look at that association across racialized groups, you get dramatically different stories. Family structure may indeed matter more for some groups than for others. So really building out that area of work will be important, I think, especially from a policy perspective. We can't assume family structure, broadly speaking, or a particular family structure means the same for every single citizen of our country if we're doing research here in the United States. Idea number 5, shifting focus toward the promotion of well-being for all families, I think could be an arguably beneficial direction to move toward. Idea 6, my second to last. Prioritize international and historical perspectives that enrich our understanding of the family and how best to study family experiences. We could have spent this whole hour doing this, just thinking about if we look across time and across space, what has family looked like? What language has even been used to describe it? What functions has family had? There is just an enormous amount of richness and diversity over time and across the globe in terms of how the family has operated and even what it has meant, what it has looked like. And so maybe we can draw from that history and draw from these international perspectives to reinvigorate how we approach this work and to be more innovative and connect back to some of those roots. And then lastly, maybe consider a program of research that you could care about that incorporates that within group. Maybe there's a particular experience, a particular family environment you feel drawn to or passionate about. You're really thinking about this intentional building out of a program of research where you zoom into that context specifically, identify what works well so that you can then propagate those findings with useful application. And I think that's it for my presentation. So I look forward to having a conversation with you all. Thank you.
We can take questions. And there also will be some coming in chat.
I just have a question. This is completely not my area at all, so I'm asking a lay question. But I was recently an article that was going around from the Atlantic on how disastrous a nuclear family was, and I wondered if that connects at all with what you're sort of saying here.
I think I heard about that article. It had a very provocative title.
Yes,
I
it
think
was
probably
sort of like, I forget exactly what the title was. I was able to read some of it, but then I think I'm not a subscriber to the Atlantic, so I don't know if it's the whole thing. But it was kind of an interesting idea that, you know, the decline of the extended families. In the past, there were extended families and business families and families working in different units, and urbanization and nuclear families, and it was actually too much stress, and only certain people could thrive in that environment.
Yeah. I think that someone actually, it's funny you mentioned this, they recently highlighted that article, and I remember encountering it briefly. I think that connects beautifully here because it calls attention to the fact that the nuclear family is a fairly and relatively recent invention, and it can work great. It has shown to work great for many. Is it optimal for all, or is it the only reasonable choice for all? Likely not, and data suggests not. And so I wouldn't say that we should all abandon that family model, because again, it might work beautifully for us for a variety of different reasons. But many of us just don't happen to be in that environment. And those pressures to be maybe in that environment at the expense of other ties to extended family, that could really, a multi-generational household seems to have a lot of potential advantages, especially from a child rearing perspective. So all that to say, I personally don't think it should be ruled out or should be become the villain of the story, the nuclear family model, but it's just one story for some, and others have other important stories to tell. And can we attend to those stories also?
Thanks so much for this talk. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the between group comparisons. And it seemed like that was cast as a problem-oriented approach. And I was wondering if there's a place for it to not be a problem-oriented approach. And how could you do that? I mean, so one of the things you suggested was shifting the reference group, although I was curious to hear if you had other ideas about how between group analysis might be fruitful in ways that aren't problem oriented.
I love the question. Let's carve out another hour to just talk.
Yeah.
It's so important because many of us are in a position where that's exactly the type of work we'll do or the type of work we'll encounter. Yeah, how do we do that well? I think framing is so important, being very clear on what am I trying to do right now? Am I trying to show how all these other family structures are doing worse than this one I'm holding up implicitly or explicitly as the gold standard or kind of gold reference point? And maybe we can think about other analytic approaches. I noted that kind of distributional overlap perspective, honoring the fact that these outcome distributions very likely overlap significantly. So that could be a whole thing to unpack there. And there might be other analytic techniques. We might even think of, and I've tried to spend some time thinking about this, might be hard for me to verbalize now, but multi-level modeling, where individuals are nested within particular family environments. And then the family environment's level 2, individuals level 1. And at level 2, I can test out family level variables as predictors of the family's average outcome value. And I don't have to say anything about a reference group necessarily. There's ways to extend that even further, but there might be ways to even bypass the need for a one family structure as a reference group approach. But I think in any case, framing, being very clear on intention, because that will, I think, inform everything else, and you'll get good alignment with your methods. Yeah.
So I think there was a tension coming in and out of your presentation about when we're thinking about families and when we're thinking about households and the extent to which they overlap or not. So I'm thinking specifically about the results on step-parent relationships. And wondering your thoughts based on your reviews and how can we be doing better to embrace the perspective that certain members of families are outside of households. So with the step-parent relationship, what's going on with the non-resident parents?
Yeah.
How do they get along with the step-parent? Are they in the picture or not? So is the step-parent sort of replacing, in a way, the kinds of interactions that another parent might do, or are they getting both? So now they have 3 parents, and that could be helpful or not if they're in conflict. So what do you do with this, and in terms of your reviews, how well do you think we're doing? Are we headed in a good direction with that in thinking about the sort of non-residential family members?
Beautiful question. Yeah. Luckily, AdHealth is reasonably well positioned, at least in my experience, to bring in those non-resident parents at least. And I've tried to map some of that out too. Like, what's the whole network here? Who's the youth living with? Who are they also connected to? And how do all those relationships manifest in concert with each other? But this is such an important conversation because we are, at the end of the day, limited by the data we have access to. And some of these large scale surveys that are so powerful from a generalizability standpoint are often by necessity limited in terms of the questions I can ask. Because we could easily spend 2 hours of a survey just charting your family environment and getting the nuance. That would be amazing, but it's so much easier said than done. So qualitative researchers have a heyday with this because they can go right to a person and say, let's chart out your family. Let's draw it. Let's map it out. And let's talk about what's going on there. And they can get the richness. It's harder to do to get the breadth. But I think a good starting point is to always approach it as not just who's in this household, but if, say, I'm interested in child well-being and development, say who is in this child's developmental space? Who exerts influence on the well-being of that child? They don't all have to live in the household. They don't have to be biologically related. That type of thinking, again, easier said than done. How do I actually go and capture that information now in a survey? But I like the framing of not household, maybe not even family as we traditionally look at it, but who's in that child's developmental space might be a good just starting point to think through how to how to approach that from a kind of data collection standpoint. Question here, yeah.
I'm curious how you measured the step-parent-child relationship as far as quality.
Mm-hmm.
Is that survey, interview, or some other variables? And I guess like what factors specifically like determine the quality of a relationship?
Yeah, so is your question about how is that done typically or how I did it in that specific study?
I guess
presented?
this specific
In that
study,
one?
yeah.
Yeah, there's these 5 items I used in Ed Health where the youth is asked a few questions about that relationship. They're asked, how satisfied are you in this relationship generally? And there's an item, how satisfied are you with the communication? How close do you feel? And so there's these kind of 5 items that you can make a strong case are well connected. You can statistically confirm they're well connected, and so you kind of create this composite or aggregate score across the items. So that's how I've done it there. Hard to capture in just one item, so it's always good when you have multiple. And then you had another question in there. What are the correlates or predictors of the relationship?
I don't think so. I think you answered.
Did I capture it? Okay.
Yeah.
All right, good. I didn't
Thank
go
you.
down a rabbit hole.
No, you're good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk, it's great. So going back to the models that you laid out, if I remember them correctly, you had kind of family structure on the left side and predicting each child outcomes on the right side conceptually at least. And when I think about that, this is kind of implicitly thinking causally. I mean, you're very careful not to use the kind of causal language. But in your reviews that you've done and the kind of analysis as you think about all the studies been published, I have to think about what's behind family structure, what's hidden, what's not pictured there. These structures don't just appear out of nowhere. And so there's all kinds of contexts and predictors of family structure. So, what's your current thinking on, what that part of this whole system should look like? Because, I think attributing causality to these kind of relationships could be really problematic in some ways. I think about marriage promotion kind of policies and so forth that, unless you think back where these structures come from, it could be quite problematic in a lot of this literature that you described.
I love that. I love that comment so much. Let me turn back here. Yeah, I think that coincides with this piece maybe a little bit here. My sense is that is a whole area that needs to really be, we need to dive into that piece. What are the things that are a bit further upstream from family structure itself? What are the larger institutional and structural forces that exert influence on subpopulations in interesting ways that actually increase or decrease the probability that they find themselves in a particular family structure? And how are those things operative on things like well-being? And so disentangling all that, I see so much value in that. And we don't see a lot of that. That actually might be an interesting review article in itself, is just trying to scour the literature and see how many studies have attempted to do that. What factors across different levels of our social ecology influence the type of family arrangement I find myself in now? There's certainly some work out there, but I think maybe a lot more work to do, because I do agree. I think that's critical. Yeah, question.
Yeah, and that last point made me think about sort of like intergenerational reproduction of family structure or persistence. Is that something that people have done work on?
I've seen there's some work where I think work out there on that. There kind of an interesting framing, just as an example. I even saw one article that talked about divorce as a social contagion, like exposure to folks behind me in my kind of intergenerational family line, or people who are in my social network. If divorces are happening there, it might actually even increase the probability that could be a viable choice for me too. And so there's, and maybe others have a lot more to say on it.
I was going to ask a question, maybe it's the last one, but it's related to a lot of I wondered in your review, I mean, I think about, and you said this, often, that, the gold standard, the nuclear family, or the 2 biological parent family. I'm just wondering if over time, as the prevalence of 2 biological parent families goes down, the association that's being estimated between whatever outcome, how that might change. Because, I mean, I think about, the corollaries to cohabitation. Early on, we found that cohabitation was associated with these negative, types of outcomes, and that's because it was very selective. It was rare, but over time, everybody cohabits, and so, that association has gone away. And I'm just wondering if the two parent, in Ad Health, that was in the mid-90s, and 52% of the adolescents lived in a two biological parent family, which is pretty low. I mean, that's just, that's almost half. And so over time, that's probably gone down. And so perhaps that family structure has become more selective in terms of, as Bob was talking about, who they are.
Yeah.
Or that, Atlantic article, I mean, is it selective? Is it selectively positive or negative? Is probably a mix. But it would be interesting to do that literature review and look at what the estimated effect and how and where that's changed. I mean, I think 2 decades is probably not enough time, but maybe from 1950.
Maybe tracking it long term.
Yeah.
Yeah, you could even think about that in like a meta-analytic framework.
Yeah.
The effect size.
Yeah, the
Pooled
effect
effect size, and how is that moderated by when the study was done?
Right,
Yeah.
that's a good idea for your next review.
Be excited about reviews, it seems like. Came up with, slides here. Yeah.
So great. I think we're out of time. Thanks so much.
Thank you.